Clara and I met in college. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, lively, and magnetic. People seemed to gravitate toward her effortlessly, drawn in by her charm and energy. I, on the other hand, was quiet and reserved, perfectly content with my books and solitude. Yet despite our differences, we clicked. It began with study sessions and grew into late-night conversations about life, dreams, and everything in between. I wanted to be a teacher to inspire young minds, while Clara dreamed of becoming a lawyer, determined to make her mark in the world. We were young, idealistic, and deeply in love. After graduation, we got married. I thought we had the perfect love story, the kind that could withstand anything. Our forever seemed certain back then. But fast forward 10 years, and I barely recognize the life we've built together or the people we've become. The changes were gradual at first, so subtle I hardly noticed them. Clara threw herself into her career, climbing the professional ladder with the tenacity and drive that had always defined her. I was proud of her success. Meanwhile, I had fulfilled my dream of becoming a teacher and found immense joy in shaping young minds. Yet somewhere along the way, our paths began to diverge. The little things, the glue that held our relationship together, started to disappear. The sweet notes we used to leave for each other stopped appearing. Her words once tucked into my briefcase and mine scrawled on her coffee mug. The long, meandering conversations that once filled our evenings gave way to silence, or worse, to curt exchanges that barely scratched the surface of our lives. I tried to fix it. Once I went so far as to recreate our very first date, a home-cooked meal and the same silly rom-com we had watched that night. I even set the table with her favorite flowers. But Clara came home late, distracted and apologetic. She kissed my cheek absently, muttered something about being exhausted, and went straight to bed. I ate alone that night, staring at the flickering TV screen, wondering when the distance between us had grown so vast. At night, I would lie awake in bed, listening to the hum of the city outside, while Clara slept soundly beside me. The bed, once a place of warmth and connection, felt cold and empty, a chasm dividing us. Sometimes I would reach out, brushing my fingers against hers, hoping for a spark of the intimacy we once shared. She never stirred. I told myself it was just a phase, that all relationships have their ebbs and flows. But deep down, I knew we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The turning point came at her father's birthday celebration. It was one of those big family gatherings where grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles all came together. Clara had insisted we attend, and I agreed, hoping it might give us a rare chance to reconnect. Her parents' home was warm and inviting, steeped in nostalgia, a reminder of simpler times. Clara moved effortlessly through the crowd, laughing and chatting with her relatives. I, as usual, found myself on the periphery, nursing a soda and offering polite smiles to familiar faces. At some point, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Clara's younger sister, Liz. She leaned against the counter, a glass of wine in hand, and asked, "How are things with Clara?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were watchful. "They're okay," I replied hesitantly, unwilling to unpack my growing unease in the middle of a family celebration. Liz raised an eyebrow. "Okay doesn't sound very convincing." Her words caught me off guard, and before I knew it, I was admitting to her how distant Clara had become, how work seemed to consume her entirely, leaving little room for us. Liz listened quietly, her gaze steady. When I finished, she swirled the wine in her glass and said something that hit me like a punch to the gut. "You know," she began carefully, "I went through something similar with my ex. He worked late all the time, always had excuses. I wanted to believe it was just work, but, well, let's just say it wasn't." I stared at her, struggling to process her words. "Are you saying?" Liz raised a hand. "I'm not saying anything for sure. I don't know Clara's situation. But sometimes when people grow distant, there's more to it than just stress or busy schedules." Her words lingered long after the party ended. I wanted to dismiss them, to believe Liz was projecting her own experiences onto me. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and once it took root, I couldn't unsee the cracks in our relationship. I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, like something out of a soap opera, but I needed answers. I told myself it was better to know the truth, no matter how painful, than to live in the dark. For weeks there was nothing. Then, one evening, the investigator sent me photos. My hands trembled as I opened the file. There she was, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant with a man I didn't recognize. They leaned in close, their faces illuminated by candlelight. In the next photo they were kissing, not a friendly peck but a deep, intimate kiss. The man, I learned, was her colleague Scott. He was older, confident, married with children, a detail that made the betrayal cut even deeper. The investigators' report chronicled their meetings, stolen moments at coffee shops, lunches that stretched into hours, and a pattern of secrecy I couldn't ignore. I stared at the photos for what felt like an eternity, my chest hollow, my mind a storm of disbelief. After everything we'd built, everything we'd shared, how could she let someone else into the sacred space of our marriage? I didn't confront Clara immediately. I didn't know how. Every time I looked at her, my mind replayed those images, those stolen moments. One night, as we sat at the dinner table, she was scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging me. My untouched plate sat before me as anger and heartbreak bubbled dangerously close to the surface. "Clara," I said, my voice breaking slightly. She looked up, startled by the sharpness in my tone. "Do you think we're us? Our marriage? Do you think it's where it's supposed to be?" Her brow furrowed, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw guilt flicker in her eyes. But then she shook her head and gave me a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Elon, you're overthinking things. We're just busy right now. Once this case is over, we'll have more time." Her words were hollow, and I knew deep down that more time would never come. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Clara's words felt hollow, promises spoken only to pacify, not to heal. She had her secrets, but now I had mine too. The photos, the reports, the undeniable truth. I held it all, unspoken but burning inside me. If she believed she could continue this facade, she was sorely mistaken. That night, as Clara slept beside me, I made my next move. The first step of my plan was to learn everything I could about Scott. The man who had intruded on our marriage was no stranger now. He was a target. I contacted the private investigator again, this time with a pointed request: dig into Scott's life. I wanted to know who he was behind the polished exterior. Within days, the answers arrived, and they painted a vivid picture. Scott was married to Susie, a stay-at-home mother devoted to their 3 children. Her world revolved around the life they had built, a life that he was so carelessly betraying. She deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered her. Reaching out to Susie was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made. I rehearsed my words endlessly, imagining every possible reaction. Finally, I called her. My voice trembled slightly as I introduced myself, but I steadied it with conviction. "I'm a concerned stranger," I said carefully. "I have something important to share. Would you meet me?" There was hesitation, of course there was, but something in my tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop the following day. Susie arrived on time, dressed simply, her warm eyes clouded with suspicion. As we sat across from each other, I felt the weight of what I was about to say. I started slowly, explaining who I was and what I'd discovered. Her face froze in disbelief, and then I slid the photos and reports across the table. Her hands trembled as she picked up the evidence. Tears welled in her eyes, and her lips quivered as she whispered, "How could he?" Her voice broke, and I could feel the raw pain radiating from her. "I'm so sorry to bring this to you," I said softly, my own heart heavy with guilt for being the bearer of such devastating news. "But I thought you deserved to know." For a long time, Susie sat silently, flipping through the damning evidence. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mixture of heartbreak and determination. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "I don't know what I'll do yet, but thank you." In the days that followed, the ripple effects of our meeting became evident. Susie confronted Scott, and the fallout was swift. The confident, polished man I had once seen in the photos began to unravel. Word of his indiscretions spread like wildfire through his workplace and social circles, and before long, he resigned from his position at the firm. The once proud man had been reduced to a shadow of himself. But my plan wasn't over. I knew Clara would soon hear about Scott's downfall, and I refused to let her control the narrative. So, one quiet evening after dinner, I laid my cards on the table. "Clara," I began, my voice steady but firm. I slid the photos across to her, watching as her eyes widened with recognition. "We need to talk." Her face paled, and her hands hesitated before picking up the damning evidence. She stared at the images, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Finally she whispered, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I replied. "Long enough to know about Scott. Long enough to see how little you valued the life we built together." What followed was a storm of emotions. Clara wept, apologized, begged for forgiveness, and swore she still loved me. But when her pleas failed to break my resolve, her tone turned sharp, defensive. "Don't you dare blame this entirely on me," she snapped, tears still streaming down her face. I cut her off, my voice firm and unyielding. "You made your choices, Clara. You betrayed me." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Clara, unable to face the fallout of her actions, packed her bags and left town. Her image as the successful, polished wife was shattered, and whispers of her betrayal followed her wherever she went. Amid the chaos, Liz became an unexpected source of comfort. We had always been friendly, but now there was a shared understanding between us, a bond forged in the fire of betrayal. She listened when I needed to vent, offered quiet support when I felt lost, and somehow she made me laugh again. Our connection grew slowly, almost unintentionally. First we met for coffee or took walks in the park. Liz's vibrant personality was a stark contrast to Clara's calculated demeanor. She was spontaneous, warm, and full of life, a light I hadn't realized I was missing. One evening, as we cooked dinner together in her cozy kitchen, something shifted. Flour dusted the counters, and laughter filled the air as we fumbled our way through a complicated recipe. It was messy, imperfect, and completely us. Later, as we sat on the couch, a storm rolling in outside, Liz lit a few candles when the power went out. The soft glow illuminated her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. She reached for my hand, her touch gentle but deliberate. I looked into her eyes, and in that moment the world seemed to fall away. I leaned in, and when our lips met, it wasn't hurried or unsure. It was natural, like coming home. That night, as the rain pattered against the windows, Liz and I crossed a line we hadn't anticipated. Wrapped in her warmth, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. In the days that followed, we decided to take things slow. We both carried scars, and we didn't want to rush into something we weren't ready for. But as time passed, it became clear we were building something real. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a park bench, Liz turned to me, her expression serious yet vulnerable. "I never thought I'd find someone after everything that happened," she said softly. "But I think I'm starting to believe in love again." I took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "Me too," I replied, my voice steady with conviction. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.